you very much. Thank you. In fact, I will narrow down a bit on the urban water theme, but before doing that, I will actually broaden out a little bit and tell you a bit about some of the work that we've been doing at OECD recently, in particular highlighting some of the work from a recent publication, our OECD Environmental Outlook to 2050. And one of the things we've done here is taken current trends and projections at current trends and projected these out to 2050. If there are no new policies in place, what will happen in terms of economic and social developments, and how will these drive changes in the environment? And what we've particularly focused on are 4 environmental areas which were identified as key global issues. Climate change, you won't be surprised to see in that list, water, biodiversity, and the fourth one is the environmental impacts of pollution, the health impacts of pollution. So that's one of the issues. I'm also drawing on some work we've had, a previous study which predates the work that the EC is doing on the economic aspects of adaptation, and a very recent book on meeting the water reform challenge. And I'll mention a few of the other publications that we have underway or have recently had which may be of relevance and interest to yourselves. But what I want to start with is a little bit on the context. What are the challenges and issues we face, the context of the urban water challenge? What is the outlook for water and water resources? How might climate change impact on water management, good water management? And what are some of the policy responses we're looking at? And that's really one of the areas that we focus on very much at OECD, which is helping governments, both OECD country governments, but also emerging economy and developing country governments, to put in place better water and other policies and policy frameworks, and looking at how these policy frameworks interact. So first of all, what are some of the contexts that we're facing? Well, by 2050, according to projections, there will be another 2.8 billion city dwellers. And in fact, we know with increasing urbanization, by that time we expect that about 70% of the total population will be based in cities. Now, the two challenges, well, a few challenges we face, but two of the challenges in terms of the people are ensuring sufficient access to water supply and also wastewater treatment. And I know this is something that Ramboll is working on, but is often forgotten in the discussions about environmental challenges, the wastewater part. It's not just access to water, but also ensuring access to wastewater treatment. A major issue with this is financing. And you may think this is something which is a priority for developing countries, because of course those are the countries which are primarily lacking access to water supply and sanitation. But it's also a major challenge in Europe and in other OECD countries, because we need to replace, we're coming to a period in many of our countries where we need to replace aging and leaking infrastructure, water infrastructure. And in some cases we have good plans in place on how we're going to finance that. In a lot of cases we actually don't. And one of the things we're doing is working with our countries to try and identify ways of ensuring sustainable financing for water supply and sanitation infrastructure over the long term. So what we're seeing is there's going to be greater and greater competition for access to water resources, and there's various ways that we're looking at and how this can be tackled. First of all is trying to ensure greater efficiency in the use of water resources, looking more at water rights and allocation of water use across different sectors and across different regions. And I'll get onto this a little bit later, because I think in the Outlook we found a somewhat surprising result in terms of agricultural water use. It's the majority of water use today, but in the future we're seeing that higher value uses of water, industry, households, energy use, are going to squeeze agriculture a bit in terms of water use. And then also looking at the development of alternative sources of water to help address this competition issue. So that includes things like desalination, water reuse and recycling schemes, etc. Another factor in this goes very much to what our colleague this morning said in terms of the IPCC results, is some of the aspects of the risk management. We have this already as an issue, and with more and more climate change happening, it's going to be a greater issue. So we need to look at how to increase storage capacities for water, and also how to better manage floods and stormwater in urban environments. So a little bit more on the context. Overall, we see we've got the quantitative issues in terms of water, and this is partly because of the competition between users, partly because of increasing groundwater depletion in a lot of areas, and these are both exacerbated. The situation of quantity is exacerbated by climate change. There's also the qualitative issues in terms of untreated wastewater. This is primarily in developing and emerging economies. Water-related disasters, by 2050, according to the projections that we've developed, we see there'll be about 1.6 billion people at risk of floods living in urban areas, primarily in coastal zones, which would be at risk of flooding. Water supply and sanitation. So we've actually seen massive improvements in this in recent years. But since 1990, another 1.8 billion people have gained some kind of access to an improved water supply system. But almost 900 million people today still lack access, and about 140 million of those are in urban environments, the majority in rural, but it's still an issue in urban environments. As we go out to 2050, we've also got projections there in terms of access to water supply and access to sanitation. So let me show you some of the results of the outlook. And as I mentioned, these are projections looking out to 2050 if there are no new policies put in place. What will the world look like? And we've used, to do this, we've actually used an OECD, at OECD we have a computable general equilibrium model that we've used together with an environmental model image which is developed in the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. So we've combined these two to get these projections. And what you can see here is global water demand to 2050 and how that's developing. And as I mentioned, one of the interesting things we see is that global water demand will increase significantly to 2050 by about 55%. This is primarily in non-OECD countries. Again, these are the countries where you're likely to get the highest increases in population. And that's as well as economic development, and those are the factors driving primarily this increase in water use. Most of the increase in water use is for manufacturing, for energy, cooling, for example, in energy systems, and also for households, for domestic use. Given this, and these tend to be higher value uses of water than agriculture, given this, we see irrigation agriculture water use actually being squeezed out a little bit. So this is going to put huge pressure on agriculture to become much more water efficient. The good news is we know there is huge scope for actually increasing the efficiency of agricultural water use, but that's not been moving as quickly as it will need to in order to meet these water projections. What else do we see? We see 4 out of 10 people in 2050 will be living in areas categorized as severe water-stressed areas. So they're going to have challenges in terms of water. And you can see this actually includes some of the regions in Europe. We do have some areas which would be challenging in terms of water stress. Part of this, a large part of this story is actually driven by the current climate and what's going to happen in terms of population growth. So we're seeing that the areas that are already water stressed are also the areas where we're going to get the largest amounts of population growth. So there's more and more people. I think it's about 1.6, 1.8 billion people who currently live in areas categorized of water stress, and in 2050 it'll be 3.9 billion. But that's because there's more and more people born in those areas. It's exacerbated by climate change. So that is included in these projections, and that means that in some regions it is going to be drier and there is going to be more water stress. Nitrogen effluents, again, the wastewater side of the story is also important. We see that by 2050, water pollution from urban sewage will actually increase by 3-fold. Again, much of this is happening in emerging economies. You can see India and China have particularly large spikes, as does large parts of Africa. But it's also an issue in some areas in Europe, Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Russia. This is still a challenge in terms of pollution. So again, as I mentioned, it's still a challenge. We've made progress, and you can actually see that quite clearly here. This figure goes back to 1990, and what you can see on the right side is how many people lack access to basic sanitation, and on the left, how many people lack access to an improved water source. And you can see the different time periods, and both are split by urban and rural. And we've got different regions of the world. So we've got OECD, which is the sort of blue at the bottom of the bar. The BRICS, that's the major emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, South Africa. And then the rest of the world is the green. And you can actually see that in most cases, we've actually significantly, particularly if you look at the rural side, significantly reduced the number of people since 1990 that are lacking access to an improved water source and lacking access to basic sanitation. So this is quite a positive story. And going forward, given the current policies, no new policies, remember, but given current policies, we see that this trend will continue. Similarly, in the urban side, it's not as clear of a story, but we do expect there to be some continued improvements. But we would still see quite a few people in 2050 who we would expect to lack access to water or basic sanitation at that time. So there is a challenge there. We've got a lot more people. We've got about 2 billion more people expected to be on the planet in 2050 compared to today. And we need to try and connect all of those to water supply and sanitation. Another challenge in terms of the context, and again this echoes some of the comments before, is in terms of weather-related disasters. And what you can see here is just some of the historical evidence of what we're seeing in terms of episodes of floods and storms, the frequency of these, that's the top graph. The second graph is looking at the number of casualties, the number of people affected from floods and droughts. And there's a couple of peaks there that you can see. You've got a drought in India, which happened at about 1987 or so. Flooding in China, which was 1997, I think it was. And then droughts in India and floods in China in the early 2000s. Similarly, the final graph is looking at the impacts on assets in terms of losses, physical losses from storms, and the peak that you can see there is actually from Hurricane Katrina. So that was a significant cost in terms of economic costs in terms of losses. So this is some of the historical evidence, and we also have some evidence of what we would expect to happen going forward, which I'll show in a moment. All of the story about water and water management and the challenges we face is going to be compounded by climate change. It's one of many stressors that we see. As was already explained very clearly, there's uncertainty and risks, which makes it difficult to manage this and to try and put in place the right policies and infrastructure to adapt to it. But it is going to be there. The extreme events are something which we need to look out for, and the need to adapt water management to climate change. One of the things that we see is that, in fact, the presence of climate change is one of the best reasons to put in place what we already know is good water policies. In many cases, adaptation to climate change is going to be about putting in place the policies we already know are needed to better adapt to better manage water. But at the same time, you also need to look for some specific hotspots and in specific locales, what will happen and what needs to be done. You need to look at who's going to benefit and how you pay for the different adaptations, and when is the right timing and sequencing of adaptation. And I think that's a particular challenge in terms of some of the infrastructure investments, trying to best judge when to put these in place so that you don't end up putting it in place too late, which we see happen often. This was the case in France a number of years ago. The environment minister had been lobbying for investments in strengthening the Seine riverbanks to prevent flooding. Everyone said, "What? This is ridiculous. It's been dry for years. We're fine. No problems, no problems." And then about 3 months later or so, we had a massive flooding. So it was a big water event. And this is, and of course, what happened immediately thereafter, her bid for the money was agreed, and so we were able to strengthen the Seine. But what we want to do is get better at actually putting these things in place before we have the extreme event. So I mentioned that we have some projections about some of the extreme events, and one of the things we've looked at, not so much projections about the extreme events, but some of the possibilities and the impacts of extreme events. And one thing we've done some work on together with some other partners is looking at coastal cities that are exposed to flooding, and we've looked at the risks in terms of assets and also in terms of people and the number of people who are at risk of this. And what I've shown you here is something. This is the sort of ranking of the world's most exposed cities to coastal flooding, and this is based on current data. And I have just given you the top 10 cities there. We also do the ranking based on the number of people exposed, and we've done some projections building on some of our outlook work, looking out to 2070 as well, which changes the scenario somewhat. What you can see is that today the Netherlands, Amsterdam and Rotterdam are the only two European cities that actually turn up in the top 10. In fact, Europe is not as much at risk in terms of assets or population as North America and certainly Asia. And as you move out to 2070, pretty much all the countries and cities on this list in terms of the top 10 are in Asia because of population growth and because of economic growth. But it is still an issue, and certainly in the Netherlands, and we'll hear later, I think, from somebody from the Netherlands about what they're doing there to actually tackle some of these challenges. So again, from some of our work on the economic aspects of adaptation, we've tried to look at what are some of the approaches that countries can take to better adapt in different sectors to climate change, and then also looked at some of the costs and where's the investment that's going to be needed. So we've just heard from our colleague Matteo from the EC that there's a lot of work going on now, really focusing on Europe and what can be done in Europe, what is already being done in Europe. But this just highlights to you some of the different types of adaptation investments which might be needed, or policies which might be needed, and approaches in different sectors, including in the water sector in terms of investing in water efficiency. That includes, for example, putting in place incentives for private actors to invest in water efficiency, households and industry, diverting or storing more water, doing better in terms of flood management. We've also got ones for agriculture, sea level rise, health, energy, and we've been trying to differentiate these by where you need direct public intervention and where you need private action. And then what we're doing, again, working with governments, is trying to identify how can public policies help support the private action and prevent situations where private actors make the wrong decision. And one of the things we do know on adaptation is there are a number of public policies that are in place, which may initially have been for good reasons, but which are actually hampering adaptation. And I'll just give you one example of those, of one of these, and this is often in terms of insurance policies for flooding. What we've seen in a few countries, this is the case in Australia and also in the US, for example, if your home is flooded out or your business is flooded out, there is insurance there for you if you rebuild in the same place. Right? Exactly in the same spot. And now one of the important ways of addressing climate change is actually when you have areas which are liable for flooding and increased flooding, you might want to actually shift the community somewhat. But of course, insurance policy, you don't get the money if you don't move back to exactly the same place. So that's something which these countries are looking at, how they can better address that and create the right incentives. Again, as I said, one of the things we tried to do was take stock of some of the costs and of doing adaptation in different sectors, and we surveyed the literature at the time, which was 2008, so this is a bit older. But one of the things we found in terms of water resources was that perhaps the majority of investments in terms of adaptation to climate change were really going to be focused on storage capacity, enhancing storage capacity, with some in terms of water treatment. At the same time, there is quite a bit, and I highlighted these two. We've also got agriculture, energy, and other sectors. But I think coastal adaptation costs are important, and so is infrastructure, particularly in the urban environment. And those are some areas which are important. The coastal adaptation one, this was somewhat interesting, I found as well, in terms of how much this might actually be. Typically, we found in most of the studies that we surveyed, it would actually be fairly low in terms of adaptation costs. But for some areas, particularly small island economies or some that were very much at risk, coastal areas very much at risk of climate change, it could be as high as 10% of GDP, the cost of adaptation. It was interesting to hear that the EU is focusing on trying to invest 20% of the budget in climate change mitigation and adaptation, and that's probably the direction we all need to be going. In terms of policy responses, the focus that we have is, first of all, as I mentioned before, water efficiency, and part of the incentive for this is better pricing of water. Water allocation, trying to get better methods for water allocation amongst sectors. As I said, irrigation water is now the biggest user of water, but in the future this isn't going to be possible, so how do we actually allocate across sectors? And trading is one of the options that a number of countries are looking at. When I talk about sectors, I'm also including the environment there, because the environment needs a core amount of water. The importance of looking at water supply and wastewater treatment. Innovation, and this can't be emphasized enough here, and I think this is something which a number of companies, including Ramboll, are really looking at more innovative ways of delivering water supply and treatment. There's other aspects in terms of alternative water resources, the business models that can be used to provide better incentives for water efficiency. Green infrastructure that's less capital intensive and reversible. There's an interesting situation in Kuala Lumpur where they've developed a tunnel which is both for traffic and also on the bottom layer. There's 3 layers, and the bottom layer is for for water runoff from the city. When it floods, they take the second layer, they stop the cars going through, and they open that up for water flow as well. And they use the top layers. There's 3 layers. The top 2 layers, the top layer is always cars. The bottom layer is always water flow. And then the middle layer can be adjusted. It can be either for water or for cars, depending on the need. And I think in the early May, they successfully, for the first time, actually opened up the middle layer and let water runoff go through when there's heavy rains, and it worked well. So that's good. But it's an interesting idea in terms of flexible infrastructure. Policy coherence, urban planning, risk management is absolutely essential, very good urban planning. And getting better at anticipating and planning for water needs, and also for the financing that's needed to supply water and sanitation. Just quickly, some work that we've done, we've looked at the impacts of water pricing on household decisions. And one of the things we found is that good water pricing can actually help to reduce water use by households by 20%. And this is across 10 different countries in OECD. What we see is that if you actually have a water charge for the amount of water you use, a variable water charge, households are much more likely to invest in water efficient washing machines, toilets, etc. And you can see that here, this is what water prices we have in place in OECD countries, a number of countries, and actually Denmark is way down on the right side, so Denmark is doing well in terms of water pricing. I mean, we do have, in most OECD countries, we've got fairly good water pricing for households now and for industry, not so great for agriculture. Which again leads to the inefficiencies in agricultural water use. In households, we've seen that since 1990, about a third of OECD countries have actually managed to reduce their total water use for the country since 1990. And that's largely, not only, but largely because of water pricing. So that's quite significant. And if we can keep going in that trend, then we will have more sustainable use of water. We have some work that's going on right now about greening cities, and I just wanted to bring this to your attention, including a number of case studies of cities. We've released one on Chicago, we have one on Paris, there's some coming on Stockholm and Kitakyushu in Japan. And if I could just leave you with this, this is some of the other work we have, some of the recent work we've done, and in fact for the 2010 report on cities and climate change, which we released at the Bella Center back at the 2010 climate convention here, we actually had a case study which was specifically on Copenhagen, and adapting to climate change. So that is available on our website, and I know we'll be hearing from the mayor shortly, who will provide us with an update on what's actually happening in Copenhagen. And then we have a number of reports that are coming out soon. The Cities and Green Growth one I just mentioned. Another major focus that we're hoping to take for 2013-2014 in our work program is actually looking at water policies for future cities, which includes getting much better indicators of water use and water quality in cities, looking at the policy frameworks needed to ensure sustainable financing of water infrastructure, looking at the integration of urban and rural, and again doing a number of case studies. So that's something that will be forthcoming. Thank you.